A German shepherd puppy, ribs like piano keys, one ear torn and bleeding, dragged itself out of a drainage ditch and collapsed at the boots of the most feared man at the Sturgis rally. 300 Hells Angels watched Garrett Hale drop to his knees in the dust. What happened next made a hardened sergeant-at-arms sprint across the campground. Within an hour, outlaws who hadn't shown emotion in decades were pulling crumpled bills from their wallets, and an animal control officer who had come to stop them was standing there in silence. Nobody in that town was prepared for what 300 bikers were about to do, or the reason why. The ground trembled before anyone saw them. It started as a low hum at the edge of Main Street in Sturgis, South Dakota, a vibration that rattled coffee cups on diner counters and made children press their faces to storefront windows. Then the sound swelled into a rolling wall of thunder, and the first chrome fender caught the August sunlight like a blade. 300 Hells Angels rolled into town on a Tuesday afternoon in the kind of formation that made people step back from the curb. They came in rows of three, their cuts weathered and patched, their faces hidden behind dark glasses and wind-burned skin. The annual rally had drawn bikers from 40 states, but this chapter, the Redlands out of Bakersfield, California, had a reputation that preceded them like a storm warning. At the front of the column rode Garrett Hale. He was 47 years old, 6'3", with a jaw like quarried granite and hands that could palm a basketball or crack a walnut without thinking about which one he was doing. His beard was streaked with grey, braided at the chin with a single leather cord, and his arms were sleeved in tattoos so dense the original skin colour was a matter of speculation. He had been riding since he was 15, patched in at 22, and had served as road captain for the Redlands for the past 11 years. He spoke rarely, smiled less, and had a way of looking at people that made them forget whatever they were about to say. The convoy pulled into the Broken Spoke campground on the western edge of town, a sprawling field of dust and trampled grass that became a temporary city every August. Garrett killed his engine and swung off his bike, a 2003 Harley-Davidson Road King with a blacked-out tank and exhaust pipes that had been welded and re-welded so many times they looked like scar tissue. He pulled off his gloves and surveyed the grounds. Tents were already going up, grills were being lit. Somewhere a stereo was playing Lynyrd Skynyrd, loud enough to drown out a conversation from 30 feet. Garrett, a shorter man with a red bandana and a gap-toothed grin, walked up beside him. This was Dale Whitfield, the chapter's sergeant-at-arms, who had been riding at Garrett's right flank since the Nevada state line. "Spot by the tree line's open. Want me to claim it?" Garrett nodded once. That was usually enough. He watched Dale walk off into the growing encampment, weaving between bikes and bedrolls with the practiced ease of a man who had set up and torn down temporary camps in more states than most people visited in a lifetime. There was a rhythm to it, the unloading, the claiming of territory, the unspoken negotiations over who got the flat ground and who got stuck on the slope. Garrett had overseen hundreds of these arrivals. Each one followed the same pattern, and the predictability of it was part of the appeal. In a life that outsiders imagined as chaotic, there was more structure than most people would believe. The townspeople of Sturgis had a complicated relationship with the rally. It brought money. Millions of dollars poured into motels, bars, restaurants, and gas stations every August. But it also brought noise, property damage, and the kind of stories that made the evening news for all the wrong reasons. The Hells Angels, in particular, were watched. Sheriff's deputies doubled their patrols when word got out a major chapter was riding in. Store owners checked their insurance policies. Parents kept their children closer. None of this was lost on Garrett. He had lived inside that perception his entire adult life. The outlaw, the menace, the man mothers warned their sons about. He had stopped trying to correct it somewhere around his 30th birthday. People believed what they needed to believe, and no amount of conversation was going to change the fact that his leather vest and his club's insignia triggered something primal in the average citizen's nervous system. He walked to the edge of the campground where a chain-link fence separated the field from a drainage ditch that ran along Route 79. The ditch was dry this time of year, choked with sun-bleached weeds and fast food wrappers blown in from the road. Garrett leaned against a fence post and lit a cigarette, watching the last bikes in the convoy find their spots. That was when he heard it. a sound so small it almost didn't register beneath the collective roar of 300 motorcycles cooling their engines. A thin, high-pitched whine, not mechanical, not human. It came from below, from the ditch. Garrett looked down. At the bottom of the drainage channel, half hidden by a clump of dead thistle, was a puppy. It was a German shepherd, probably 4 or 5 months old, and it was in terrible shape. Its right hind leg was twisted at an angle that made Garrett's stomach tighten. The fur along its ribs was matted with something dark, blood or mud or both, and its breathing came in shallow, rapid bursts that made its whole body shudder. Its eyes were open but glassy, focused on nothing. As Garrett stared, the puppy dragged itself forward with its front legs, its back end trailing uselessly. It moved maybe 2 feet before its strength gave out, and it collapsed in the dust at the base of the fence, directly at Garrett's boots. It looked up at him. One ear was torn. A fly landed on its muzzle, and it didn't flinch. Garrett Hale, who had not cried since his mother's funeral in 2009, felt something crack open behind his ribs. He dropped to one knee. "Don't touch it." The voice came from behind the fence, on the roadside. A woman in a beige polo shirt with a Meade County Animal Control patch on the shoulder was standing on the shoulder of Route 79, a clipboard in one hand and a phone in the other. She was maybe 35, with her hair pulled back tight and an expression that suggested she had already decided how this interaction was going to go. Her name was Colleen Archer, and she had been driving past when she saw the biker kneeling by the ditch. She had pulled over not out of concern for the dog, but out of concern for what a Hell's Angel might do to an injured animal. "I said don't touch it," she repeated. "That dog could be rabid, could bite you." Garrett didn't look up. He had already extended the back of his hand toward the puppy's nose, slowly, the way his grandfather had taught him with farm dogs in eastern Oregon 40 years ago. The puppy sniffed once, weakly, and then pressed its muzzle against his knuckles. "He's not rabid," Garrett said. His voice was lower than Colleen expected, quieter. "He's been hit by something. Car, maybe. Legs broken bad. Sir, I need you to step away from the animal. We'll handle this." "How?" The question was simple, but the way Garrett asked it, without hostility, without challenge, just a flat factual inquiry, made Colleen pause. "We'll transport it to the county facility. They'll assess it. And then?" Colleen shifted her weight. She knew what happened to injured strays at the county facility, especially during rally week when the shelter was already over capacity with dogs that had been spooked by the noise and run off from their yards. An animal this badly hurt, with no collar, no chip, no owner, the math was straightforward. "That's not up to me," she said. "It's up to somebody." By now Dale had noticed Garrett's absence and come looking. He arrived at the fence line and looked down at the puppy, then at Garrett, then at the animal control officer on the other side. "What have we got?" Dale asked. "Puppy," Garrett said. "Needs a vet, now." Dale crouched beside him. He was not a sentimental man. He had done 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the club, and sentimentality had been trained out of him in Helmand Province. But the sound the puppy made when it tried to lift its head hit a frequency that bypassed his defenses entirely. "I'll get the van," Dale said. "Sir, you can't just take a stray animal," Colleen started. "Ma'am." Garrett stood up. At his full height, with his shoulders squared and his shadow falling across her clipboard, the visual was exactly the kind that confirmed every fear she had ever been taught to have about men who looked like him. But his voice stayed level. "This dog is going to die in your county facility. You know it and I know it. I'm going to take it to a veterinarian and pay for whatever it needs. You can write that down on your clipboard, or you can try to stop me, but I'd rather you just told me where the nearest vet clinic is." Colleen stared at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Harding Veterinary. It's on Lozelle Street, about 2 miles east. Dr. Kimball, she's good." Garrett nodded. "Thank you." Dale was already jogging back toward the campground. Within 3 minutes, word had traveled through the entire Redlands chapter. Within 5, it had spread to the allied clubs camped nearby. Within 10, something extraordinary was happening. Bikers were lining up. Not to gawk, not to take photos, not to tell stories later at the bar. They were lining up to help. A prospect named Tucker Greaves, 24 years old, skinny as a rail, with a nervous energy that made him look like he was always about to start running, appeared with a clean towel from his saddlebag. A woman named Donna Prescott, who rode with the Devil's Apostles out of Wyoming and had been a veterinary technician before she started welding full-time, knelt beside the puppy and checked its gums. "He's shocky," Donna said. "Gums are white. We need to keep him warm and get fluids into him fast." "We've got a first aid kit in the support van," someone called out. "I've got saline in my kit," said another voice, this one belonging to Ray Hutchins, a retired paramedic from Montana who still carried a trauma bag on every ride because, as he put it, old habits don't die, they just get heavier. Garrett lifted the puppy carefully, cradling it against his chest. The animal weighed almost nothing, 20, maybe 25 pounds, when it should have been closer to 40 for its age. It had been starving long before it had been hit. Its ribs pressed against Garrett's forearms like the keys of a broken piano. The puppy's body was hot, fever hot, the kind of heat that radiated through fur and skin and told a story of infection or internal damage that couldn't wait. As Garrett turned from the ditch, the campground had gone quiet. Not silent. 300 motorcycles and their riders could never achieve true silence. But the quality of the noise had changed. The music was still playing, the grills were still smoking, but people had stopped talking. They were watching. From one end of the broken spoke to the other, men in leather and denim and faded tattoos were standing still, looking at a 6'3" road captain carrying a dying puppy across a dusty field like it was the most important cargo he had ever held. Nobody laughed, nobody made a comment, nobody looked away. He carried it to the van and Dale drove. Donna rode in the back with the puppy, monitoring its breathing. Tucker followed on his bike. Colleen Archer stood on the shoulder of Route 79 and watched the van pull away. The dust from its tires hung in the air for a long time, suspended in the August heat like a question she couldn't quite formulate. She looked down at her clipboard, then back at the road. She had not written anything down. In 12 years of animal control work, she had developed a reliable instinct for reading situations. The neglectful owner, the aggressive stray, the well-meaning civilian who made things worse. None of her categories fit what she had just witnessed. Behind her, in the campground, 296 Hells Angels and affiliated riders stood in clusters, waiting for news. The afternoon had taken on a strange, suspended quality, as if the normal rhythms of the rally, the drinking, the music, the posturing, had been put on hold by an unspoken agreement that nobody remembered making. Some of them had already started pulling out their wallets. Dr. Patricia Kimball had been a veterinarian in Sturgis for 23 years. She had seen everything the rally brought: dogs with burns from exhaust pipes, cats that had crawled into engine blocks for warmth, the occasional horse spooked into a barbed wire fence by the noise. But she had never seen a van full of Hells Angels pull up to her clinic at 4:30 on a Tuesday afternoon and carry an injured puppy through her front door like it was made of glass. Garrett set the dog on the examination table with a gentleness that made Patricia's receptionist, a college student named Wendy Shaw, take an unconscious step backward. Not from the dog, but from the dissonance between what she was seeing and what she had expected to see. "He was in the ditch by the campground," Garrett said. "Right hind leg's broken. Donna says he's in shock." Patricia pulled on gloves and began her assessment. The puppy whimpered once when she palpated the leg, but otherwise lay still. Too still. "This isn't just a broken leg," Patricia said after a minute. "There's a fracture, yes, comminuted, multiple fragments, but there's also significant internal bruising. His abdomen is distended. I need to do x-rays and blood work. This is going to take a while." "We'll wait," Garrett said. "It could also be expensive. We're talking surgery, possibly multiple procedures, post-op care." "How much?" Patricia hesitated. She had learned years ago not to give estimates that scared people off before treatment could begin. Conservatively, $4,000 to $5,000. If there's internal damage that requires surgery, it could go higher. Garrett pulled out his phone. He sent a single text message to Dale. "Dog needs surgery. Going to cost $5,000 minimum. Maybe more." Dale's response came in 11 seconds. "How do you want to handle it?" Garrett typed, "Pass the hat." What happened next would become the story that Sturgis talked about for years, not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet. Dale walked to the center of the Redlands camp and stood on a picnic table. He didn't shout. He didn't make a speech. He held up his phone, showed the text, and said, "Garrett's asking." That was all it took. The collection started in the Redlands camp and radiated outward like a ripple in a pond. It passed through the Devil's Apostles, then the Iron Order, then the Bandidos and the Mongols and the Outlaws and a dozen independent clubs whose names were hand-stitched on homemade cuts. It reached the vendors on Main Street and the food truck operators in the fairgrounds. It reached the bartenders at the Full Throttle Saloon, who emptied their tip jars without being asked. It reached a group of weekend riders from Minneapolis who had no club affiliation at all, but who had seen the puppy being carried to the van and couldn't get the image out of their heads. By the time Garrett's phone buzzed again, 45 minutes later, Dale's message read, 11,247 and counting. Some guys are still looking for change. Garrett showed the screen to Patricia Kimball. She read the number, looked at him and said, "I'll prep for surgery." The operation took 3 hours. Patricia called in her colleague, Dr. Nathan Harding, the clinic's founder, 71 years old and supposedly retired but still the best orthopedic surgeon in western South Dakota, to handle the leg. The fracture required a steel plate and 6 screws. The internal bruising turned out to be a small splenic laceration that was already clotting on its own, which Patricia called the one piece of good luck this dog has had in his life. While the puppy was in surgery, Garrett sat in the waiting room. He did not pace, he did not check his phone. He sat in a plastic chair with his hands on his knees and stared at the wall where a poster about heartworm prevention was taped at a slight angle. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the faint antiseptic smell of the clinic mixed with the leather and road dust scent that clung to his vest. He could hear the muffled sounds of the surgical suite, the beep of monitors, the occasional metallic clink of instruments. And each sound was a small reassurance that something was still happening, that the puppy was still fighting. Donna sat beside him, her hands clasped between her knees. She had not said anything since they arrived, but her silence was the kind that carried weight, the silence of someone who understood that words would not make the next 3 hours pass any faster. Tucker sat on the floor because there were only 2 chairs, and he was the prospect. He had his back against the wall and his knees drawn up, and he was fidgeting with a loose thread on his jeans the way he always did when he was anxious, which was most of the time. At some point during the second hour, the front door opened and Colleen Archer walked in. She was off duty. She had changed out of her uniform into jeans and a flannel shirt, and she was carrying a paper bag. "I brought food," she said. "Figured you hadn't eaten." Garrett looked at her. Then he looked at the bag. Then he said, "Thank you." Colleen sat down in the remaining chair. Nobody spoke for a while. Then she said, "I owe you an apology." "No, you don't." "I assumed the worst. When I saw you kneeling by that ditch, I thought—" She stopped. She didn't finish the sentence because she didn't need to. They both knew what she had thought. "I was wrong." Garrett unwrapped a sandwich. It was turkey and Swiss on sourdough. He took a bite, chewed, swallowed. "You weren't wrong about me specifically," he said. "You were wrong about the idea you had of me. There's a difference. One's personal. The other's just a story somebody told you a long time ago that you never had a reason to question." Colleen considered this. "That's a generous way to put it. I've had a lot of practice." The puppy survived the surgery. Patricia Kimball came into the waiting room at 8:15 that evening with blood on her scrubs and a cautious smile on her face. "He's stable," she said. "The leg is set. The splenic laceration is holding. He's going to need at least a week of post-operative monitoring and then months of rehabilitation. But he's a fighter. His vitals are stronger than I expected for an animal in his condition." Garrett stood up. "Can I see him?" Patricia led him to the recovery room where the puppy lay on a heated pad inside a stainless steel kennel. His right hind leg was wrapped in a bright blue cast, and an IV line ran to a catheter in his front paw. His eyes were closed. His breathing was slow, and even for the first time since Garrett had found him. Garrett crouched in front of the kennel and put his fingers through the wire. The puppy's nose twitched. "You need a name," Garrett said quietly. He thought for a moment. "Flint." He said it once, and it stuck. Back at the campground, the news of Flint's survival spread faster than the collection had. Phones lit up across the grounds. Men who would not have described themselves as emotional in any context felt something shift in their chests when they heard the puppy had made it through. The celebration was not loud. There were no fireworks, no cheering. Instead, there was a kind of collective exhalation, as if 300 people had been holding their breath at the same time and could finally let go. But the story did not stay inside the campground. A reporter from the Rapid City Journal named Sharon Caldwell had been covering the rally. The noise complaints, the arrests, the usual litany of outlaw biker causes trouble stories that her editor expected every August. She had heard about the collection from a bartender at the Full Throttle and had driven to the veterinary clinic expecting to find an angle about bikers using a puppy for publicity. What she found instead was Garrett Hale sitting in a plastic chair, eating a turkey sandwich brought to him by an animal control officer who had come back on her own time to apologize for judging him. Sharon sat in her car for 10 minutes before going inside. When she did, she introduced herself and asked if she could ask a few questions. "About what?" Garrett said. "About what you did today." "I didn't do anything. I picked up a dog." 300 people donated over $11,000 in less than an hour. That's not nothing. Garrett looked at her. "You want to know why bikers care about a dog?" "I want to understand it, yes." Garrett leaned back in his chair. The plastic creaked under his weight. "Let me ask you something. If a church group had found that puppy, if a bunch of guys in khakis and polo shirts had carried it to a vet and passed the hat, would you be here?" Sharon opened her mouth, then closed it. "No," Garrett said, "you wouldn't. Because that story fits. Nice people do nice things. Nobody needs to understand that. But when we do it, it's a mystery. It's news. Because the story you've got in your head about us doesn't have a chapter for this. I'm not trying to... I know you're not. I'm not angry. I'm telling you something. Every man in that campground has been looked at the way you're looking at me right now. Like we're a puzzle. Like compassion from us needs an explanation that compassion from other people doesn't. That dog was dying. We had the money. We had the hands. We had the time. That's the whole story. There's no mystery in it unless you bring one with you." Sharon Caldwell wrote the article that night. It ran in the Rapid City Journal the next morning with the headline, "Rally Bikers Raise Thousands to Save Injured Puppy." It was picked up by the Associated Press by noon. By evening, it had been shared over 200,000 times on social media, and the comments sections were full of people expressing surprise. Surprise that Hell's Angels could be tender. Surprise that outlaws could be generous. Surprise that the world contained people who didn't fit the categories they'd been sorted into. The surprise itself was the point. It was the breaking, every share, every comment that said, "I never expected this from bikers," was an admission of the story they had been carrying, the one Garrett had described to Sharon. And the moment they said it out loud, they had to reckon with where that story came from and whether it had ever been true. Meanwhile, Flint slept. His chest rose and fell in the warm kennel. His torn ear twitched in a dream. He did not know he was the center of anything. He was just a puppy who had been hurt and was, for the first time in what might have been his entire short life, safe. 2 days later, Dr. Kimball allowed Garrett to take Flint back to the campground for supervised visits. The scene that followed defied every mental image the word biker rally had ever conjured. 300 of the most visually intimidating human beings in the state of South Dakota took turns sitting on the ground beside a German Shepherd puppy in a blue cast, letting it sniff their hands, adjusting its blanket, arguing about whether it was too hot for the dog to be outside and whether the shade from the oak tree was sufficient. Dale Whitfield, who had once broken a man's jaw in a bar fight in Reno, sat cross-legged in the dirt for 45 minutes while Flint slept with his muzzle resting on Dale's boot. Tucker Greaves, the nervous prospect, built a small ramp out of plywood scraps so Flint wouldn't have to navigate the step into the support van. Ray Hutchins, the retired paramedic, appointed himself Flint's personal medical monitor and checked the dog's temperature every 2 hours with a thermometer he had sterilized with whiskey, because that was what he had. Colleen Archer came back 3 more times that week. She brought dog food, a leash, a collar, and a bag of treats she had driven 30 miles to buy from a specialty pet store in Rapid City. She told Garrett she had put in a formal request with the county to waive the stray hold period so he could adopt Flint without a waiting period. "You don't have to do that," Garrett said. "I know I don't. I want to." The rally ended on a Sunday. The campground emptied in reverse order of how it had filled. The independents and weekend riders first, then the smaller clubs, then the major chapters one by one, their departures staggered by tradition and road protocol. By noon, the Redlands were among the last groups still packed. Garrett stood by his road king with Flint in his arms. The puppy had gained 3 pounds in a week. His eyes were clear and alert. His right hind leg, still in its cast, stuck out at an awkward angle, but he had already learned to compensate, hopping on 3 legs with a determination that made everyone who saw it laugh and then feel something they couldn't quite name. Dr. Kimball had given Garrett a detailed rehabilitation plan. 8 weeks of restricted activity, physical therapy exercises to rebuild muscle in the injured leg, follow-up X-rays at 4 and 8 weeks, a potential second surgery to remove the plate once the bone had fully healed. She had also given him her personal cell phone number, something she had never done for a client in 23 years of practice. "You call me anytime," she said, "day or night. If something seems off, don't wait." "I won't." "And Garrett?" "Yeah?" "He chose well, collapsing at your feet." Garrett looked down at the puppy. Flint was gnawing on the zipper of his vest with the single-minded focus that only a 5-month-old dog could sustain. He didn't choose anything, he just ran out of strength in the right place. "Maybe. But I've been doing this a long time, and I've learned that where an animal stops sometimes matters more than why." Garrett shook her hand, a small gesture, but Patricia noticed the care in it, the way he modulated his grip without thinking about it. He was tough, he simply didn't need her to know it. The Redlands rolled out at 1 o'clock. The formation was the same as it had been coming in, 3 abreast, Garrett at the front, Dale at his right flank, with one addition. Tucker Greaves drove the support van at the rear of the column, with Flint secured in a crate that had been padded with 3 sleeping bags, 2 pillows, and a stuffed buffalo that someone had bought from a tourist shop on Main Street because they thought the dog might want something to chew on that wasn't a zipper. The convoy passed through downtown Sturgis on its way to the highway. The streets were quieter now, the rally winding down, the town beginning the slow process of sweeping up and returning to itself. But as the Redlands passed the intersection of Main and Lazelle, the corner where Harding Veterinary stood, Garrett saw something that made him ease off the throttle. Dr. Kimball was standing on the sidewalk in front of her clinic. Next to her was her receptionist, Wendy. Next to Wendy was Colleen Archer in her animal control uniform, back on duty. And next to Colleen was Sharon Caldwell, the reporter, with a notebook in her hand but her pen in her pocket. They were waving. Not the polite, distant wave that townspeople gave passing bikers to acknowledge their existence without inviting conversation. This was something else. Colleen was smiling. Wendy was holding up a sign she had made from a piece of cardboard and a marker. It read, "Ride safe, Flint." Garrett raised his left hand off the handlebar and held it up. Not a wave exactly, but an acknowledgement. Behind him, 300 engines rumbled in unison, and from somewhere in the middle of the column, someone honked a horn twice. Then someone else did. Then they all did, and for about 15 seconds, the entire Redlands chapter laid on their horns in a sound that was not thunder, but something closer to applause. The drive back to Bakersfield took 3 days. At every stop, gas stations in Wyoming, diners in Utah, rest areas in Nevada, Flint became the center of gravity. Strangers who would have crossed the street to avoid the convoy were kneeling beside the van, asking to see the puppy, asking about the surgery. A state trooper in Elko pulled them over for a routine check, saw Flint, and spent 20 minutes showing photos of his own German Shepherd. Garrett watched all of this with quiet attention. Something was shifting in him, not a revelation, but a recalculation. The wall between his world and the public's had always felt one-sided, built by people who feared what they didn't understand. But he was beginning to see that both sides had laid bricks, and what Flint had done, what his helplessness had made possible, was to crack that wall wide enough for people on both sides to see something they recognized. Not goodness exactly, something more basic, the inability to walk past suffering. He arrived in Bakersfield on a Wednesday evening. The sun was setting behind the Sierra Nevada foothills, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust that reminded him of the color Flint's coat turned in certain light. His apartment was a two-bedroom unit above a transmission shop on Union Avenue, and it smelled like motor oil and stale coffee, the two constants of his domestic life for the past decade. The stairwell was narrow and the railing wobbled, and he climbed it carefully with Flint pressed against his chest, the puppy's warm weight a new kind of anchor. He set Flint on the couch and stood in his living room, looking at a dog that was already falling asleep on a cushion that had never held anything softer than a stack of motorcycle magazines. Over the following weeks, Garrett rebuilt his life around rehabilitation schedules and veterinary appointments. He found a local vet, Dr. Christine Weber, who took over Flint's care and marveled at the quality of the surgical work. "Whoever did this plate knew what they were doing," she said. "This dog's going to walk normally. It's going to take time, but the bone is healing clean." Flint's cast came off at 6 weeks. He was tentative at first, holding the leg up out of habit, but within days he was putting weight on it, and within 2 weeks he was walking, stiffly, unevenly, but walking. Garrett took him to the parking lot behind the transmission shop every morning and every evening for his exercises, and the mechanics who worked downstairs started coming out to watch and then to help, and then to bring treats, and then to argue about whether Flint liked the beef-flavored ones or the peanut butter ones better. Months later, on a cool November morning, Garrett walked Flint down the sidewalk near Union Avenue. Flint was full-grown now, 85 pounds of muscle and black and tan fur, with a slight hitch in his right hind leg that would never fully disappear. He walked beside Garrett with his shoulder against the man's knee, not because he was trained to heel, but because that was where he had decided he belonged. A woman passing in the other direction saw the vest, the patches, the tattoos. She pulled her child closer. Then she saw the dog, and the dog saw her child, and Flint's tail began to move. Not a full wag, but a tentative sweep, an offer. The child reached out. The mother hesitated. Garrett stopped walking and looked at her, and whatever she saw in his face, patience, maybe, or just the absence of threat, made her let go of her child's hand. The child touched Flint's head. Flint leaned into it. The mother looked at Garrett. "Beautiful dog," she said. "He is," Garrett said. They kept walking, a man and his dog moving through a world that was slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably learning to see them for what they actually were,